Howard, we need to talk. I tried to keep my voice steady as I faced my husband across the living room. He looked up from his newspaper, eyebrows raised. What is it, dear? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. It's about the house. I overheard you on the phone earlier, talking to your sister Ellen about giving it to her. Howard's expression hardened. So what if I did? It's my family's property, and I'll do with it as I please. But this is our home, Howard, I protested. We've lived here for 40 years, raised our children here. You can't just decide to give it away without consulting me. I don't need your permission, he snapped. If you don't like it, we can get a divorce. It's that simple. His words hit me like a slap in the face. A divorce? After everything we'd been through together? I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, refusing to show weakness. Fine, I said, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. If that's how you want to play it, then let me tell you something about your precious sister Ellen. Howard's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Years ago, when we were struggling to make ends meet, Ellen secretly mortgaged the family farm behind your back. She took out a huge loan and nearly lost the whole property. Howard's face drained of color. That's impossible. Ellen would never do something like that. Oh, but she did, I said, my voice growing stronger as I saw the doubt creep into his eyes. I found the paperwork in the attic, hidden away. She's been lying to you all this time, Howard. So much for family loyalty. For a moment, Howard looked utterly lost, as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Then his expression hardened once more, and he stood up, towering over me. You're lying, he growled. Ellen would never betray me like that. I'm not lying, Howard, I said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. I have the proof, right here. I pulled a sheaf of papers from my pocket and held them out to him. He snatched them from my hand, his eyes scanning the documents. I could see the moment the truth hit him, the way his shoulders slumped and the color drained from his face. How could she? He whispered, sinking back into his chair. I felt a twinge of pity for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of grim satisfaction. Finally, after all these years, the truth was out in the open. Now you know, I said, my voice hard. So don't you dare talk to me about giving away our home to that lying, manipulative woman. Howard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the damning papers in his hands. I turned and walked away, leaving him to grapple with the realization that the person he trusted most in the world had betrayed him in the worst way possible. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Ellen's deceit had shaken Howard to his core, but I knew better than to think he would give up his loyalty to her so easily. This was just the beginning. I would have to be strong, resilient if I wanted to protect what was rightfully mine. And after 40 years of putting my family first, it was time I started looking out for myself. The days following my confrontation with Howard were some of the most difficult I'd faced in our marriage. The weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the lies and deception that had been festering beneath the surface for years. As I went about my daily routine, caring for the house and tending to the chores that had once brought me a sense of purpose, I found myself questioning everything. Had it all been a lie? Had Howard ever truly loved me, or had I simply been a convenient partner to maintain the illusion of a happy family? I remembered the early days of our marriage, when we were young and full of dreams. Howard had been so different then, attentive, affectionate, and eager to build a life together. We had laughed and danced in this very living room, our bodies intertwined as we swayed to the music, lost in the promise of forever. But somewhere along the way, that spark had faded. Howard had become consumed by his work, his ambition, and his loyalty to his sister Ellen. I had tried to be the dutiful wife, supporting him, caring for our home and children, but it never seemed to be enough. As I scrubbed the kitchen counters, my mind drifted to the countless times I had bitten my tongue, swallowing my frustrations and resentments for the sake of keeping the peace. Howard's temper was legendary, and I had learned early on that it was easier to acquiesce than to risk his wrath. But now, in the aftermath of his betrayal, I found myself questioning those sacrifices. Had I given up too much of myself in the name of family? Had I allowed Howard and Ellen to take advantage of my loyalty, my willingness to put their needs before my own? The sound of Howard's voice drifted in from the living room, where he was on the phone with Ellen. I strained to catch their words, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and dread. "Can't believe she would do this," Howard was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything we've been through, everything I've done for her." Ellen's response was muffled, but I could imagine the soothing tones she was using, the way she would twist the truth to suit her own agenda. She had always been the master manipulator, playing on Howard's sense of family duty and loyalty. "You're right," Howard said, his voice growing stronger. "She's the one who betrayed us. We have to protect what's ours, no matter what." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Protect what's ours? Did he truly believe that the house, the property that had been in my family for generations, belonged solely to him and Ellen? In that moment, I knew that I couldn't back down. Ellen's web of deceit had ensnared Howard for far too long, and it was time for me to take a stand. I would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and I would fight for what was rightfully mine. As I listened to Howard's footsteps retreating down the hall, I felt a newfound sense of determination settle over me. The illusion of our perfect marriage had shattered, but in its place was a resolve that burned brighter than ever before. I would not be a victim any longer. I would be the architect of my own destiny. In the days that followed, I found myself consumed by a burning desire to uncover the truth about Ellen's deceit. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I could finally see the depth of her manipulation and greed. I spent hours poring over old financial records, sifting through dusty boxes in the attic and the basement, searching for any shred of evidence that might shed light on her misdeeds. And as I delved deeper, the picture became clearer. Ellen had been bleeding the family dry for years, taking out loans and mortgages without Howard's knowledge, all in the name of funding her lavish lifestyle. The more I uncovered, the sicker I felt. How could she have done this to her own brother, the man who had always been her staunchest ally? And how could Howard have been so blind to her betrayal? As I sat amidst the piles of paperwork, my mind drifted back to my beloved Aunt Margaret. She had been the one constant in my life, a guiding light in the darkest of times. I could still hear her gentle voice, urging me to stand up for myself, to never let anyone take advantage of my kindness. "You're stronger than you know, my dear," she would say, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Never let anyone make you feel small." Aunt Margaret had been the one who taught me to see the world differently, to question the status quo and fight for what was right. She had been my rock, my confidante, and her loss had left a void in my life that I had never been able to fill. But now, as I sat surrounded by the evidence of Ellen's betrayal, I felt her presence more strongly than ever before. It was as if she was whispering in my ear, urging me to be brave, to stand up and fight for what was mine. I thought about Howard, and the way he had so easily dismissed my concerns, choosing to believe his sister's lies over my truth. I thought about the years of sacrifice and compromise, the countless times I had swallowed my pride and put his needs before my own, and in that moment, I knew that I couldn't confront him. Not yet. If I did, he would only deny the truth, or worse, turn his anger and frustration towards me. No, I needed to gather more evidence to build an ironclad case that even he couldn't refute. With renewed determination, I dove back into the records, meticulously documenting every transaction, every loan, every shred of proof that Ellen had been bleeding the family dry. I would leave no stone unturned, no detail overlooked. As the days turned into weeks, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. For too long, I had been content to play the role of the dutiful wife, putting my own needs and desires aside for the sake of keeping the peace. But now, with the truth laid bare before me, I knew that I could no longer stay silent. Ellen's web of lies had ensnared us all, but I was determined to break free. And when the time was right, I would confront Howard with the truth, no matter how painful it might be. This was my legacy, my family's legacy, and I would not let anyone, not even the man I had once loved, take that away from me. The weeks dragged on, and the tension between Howard and me grew thicker with each passing day. I could sense his frustration, his confusion at the sudden shift in our dynamic. For so long, he had been the unquestioned authority in our household, and now I was challenging that power structure at every turn. Finally, after months of gathering evidence and steeling my resolve, I decided it was time to confront him. I chose the occasion of our niece's birthday party, knowing that the family would be gathered and that Howard would be less likely to cause a scene in public. As we arrived at my sister-in-law's house, I could feel the weight of the documents in my purse, the damning proof of Ellen's betrayal. Howard seemed oblivious, chatting amiably with his brother as we made our way inside. The party was in full swing, with children running underfoot and the adults clustered in small groups, sipping drinks and making polite conversation. I caught sight of Ellen across the room, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer dress a stark contrast to the casual attire of the other guests. She met my gaze, and for a moment I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. She knew, I realized. Somehow she had sensed that the carefully constructed facade she had built was beginning to crumble. I took a deep breath and made my way over to Howard, who was engaged in conversation with a group of his colleagues. "Howard," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "We need to talk." He turned to me, a look of annoyance crossing his features. "Can't it wait, Lenore? We're at a party." "No," I said firmly. "It can't wait. This is important." Howard must have sensed the gravity in my tone, because he excused himself from the group and followed me into the kitchen, where we could have some semblance of privacy. "What is it?" he demanded, his arms crossed over his chest. Without a word, I reached into my purse and pulled out the stack of documents I had compiled. Financial statements, loan agreements, mortgage papers, all of it laid bare for him to see. Howard's eyes widened as he took in the sheer volume of evidence before him. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice wavering. "Proof," I said, my voice ringing with conviction. "Proof of everything Ellen has done. The lies, the deceit, the way she's been bleeding our family dry for years." Howard's face contorted with anger. "That's ridiculous," he spat. "Ellen would never do something like that." "Open your eyes, Howard," I cried, thrusting the papers at him. "It's all right here in black and white. She's been taking out loans, mortgaging properties, all without your knowledge." For a moment, Howard looked torn, his gaze flickering between the damning evidence in his hands and the door that led back to the party, where Ellen no doubt waited. Then, something seemed to shift in his expression. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed with a fury I had rarely seen directed at me. "You're lying," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "This is just another one of your schemes to turn me against my own family." Before I could respond, he had stormed out of the kitchen, the papers scattered at his feet. I heard raised voices from the living room, and then the unmistakable sound of Ellen's shrill tones cutting through the din. "How dare you accuse me of such things?" she was shouting, her voice dripping with outrage. "After everything I've done for this family." I steeled myself and stepped into the living room, where the party had ground to a halt. All eyes were on me, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort etched on the faces of our friends and relatives. "It's the truth, Ellen," I said, my voice ringing out clearly, "and you know it." Ellen's gaze met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but then her expression hardened, and she turned to Howard, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Howard, you can't believe her," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "She's just trying to turn you against me like she always has." Howard looked torn, his gaze darting between us. I could see the conflict raging within him, the struggle between the love and loyalty he felt for his sister and the growing realization that I might be telling the truth. In that moment, I knew that my marriage was hanging by a thread. Howard had to choose, his wife or his sister, the truth or the lies that had sustained him for so long. As I met his gaze, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or a glimmer of understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that chilled me to the bone. "Get out," he said, his voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "Get out of my sight, and don't come back until you're ready to apologize for this nonsense." I felt the weight of his words like a physical blow, but I refused to back down. Not this time. "Fine," I said, holding my head high. "But mark my words, Howard. The truth will come out one way or another, and when it does, you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices." With that, I turned and walked out of the party, my heart pounding in my ears. I had taken a stand, drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back now. The battle lines had been drawn, and as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I knew that the war was just beginning. In the days following the disastrous party, I found myself adrift, untethered from the life I had known for so long. Howard had made his choice, and though it stung deeply, I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing. As the news of our estrangement spread through our social circles, I braced myself for the inevitable whispers and sideways glances, but to my surprise, I found myself buoyed by a wave of support from unexpected quarters. Old friends, the ones I had drifted away from over the years as I devoted myself to being the perfect wife and mother, reached out with open arms. Ruth, my dearest confidant from our younger days, was the first to show up on my doorstep, a bottle of wine in one hand and a fierce determination in her eyes. "Enough is enough, Lenore," she said, pulling me into a fierce embrace. "It's time you started living for yourself." Her words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with the newfound sense of purpose that had been kindled in the aftermath of my confrontation with Howard and Ellen. For too long, I had allowed myself to be defined by my roles as wife and mother, sacrificing my own dreams and desires in the name of keeping the peace. But now, with the truth laid bare and the illusion of my perfect marriage shattered, I felt a sense of liberation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in decades, it was mine to choose. In the weeks that followed, I found myself surrounded by a growing network of support. Old friends, rediscovered relatives, even strangers who had heard whispers of my story and felt compelled to reach out. It was as if the universe had conspired to remind me that I was not alone, that there was a world beyond the confines of my fractured marriage. Together, we began to lay the groundwork for my new life, one step at a time. Ruth helped me navigate the legal complexities of separating from Howard, introducing me to a fierce attorney who promised to fight for my rights to the house and the property that had been in my family for generations. My cousin Elaine, who I had lost touch with over the years, showed up on my doorstep one day, her arms laden with boxes of old family photos and mementos. "I thought you might want these," she said, her eyes shining with understanding, "to remind you of where you came from and who you really are." As I sifted through the boxes, memories came flooding back. Summers spent on my grandparents' farm, the smell of freshly baked pies wafting through the kitchen, the sound of my aunt's laughter echoing across the fields. These were the moments that had shaped me, the threads that wove together the tapestry of my life, and I clung to them like a lifeline. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more resolute in my determination to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Howard's betrayal still stung, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer alone, that I had an army of allies at my back, ready to support me in whatever lay ahead. And as for Ellen, well, her web of lies had finally begun to unravel, and the once revered sister was now a pariah in our family circles. I caught glimpses of her at gatherings, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer clothes, a stark contrast to the shame and isolation that clung to her like a shroud. In those moments, I felt a twinge of satisfaction, a sense of justice being served. But more than that, I felt a sense of pity for the woman who had sacrificed her own integrity and family bonds in the name of greed and self-preservation. As for me, I was done being a victim. I was done allowing others to dictate the course of my life. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more resilient, more determined to forge a path that was truly my own. And as I looked ahead to the future, I knew that whatever challenges lay in store, I would face them head-on, bolstered by the strength of my convictions and the unwavering support of those who had rallied around me. This was my life, my story, and I was writing the next chapter. As the weeks turned into months, the tension between Howard and I only grew more palpable. Our once loving household had become a battleground, with each of us clinging to our own version of the truth, our words like weapons aimed at wounding the other. It was during one of those heated exchanges that the inevitable confrontation finally occurred. Ellen had been stoking the flames of Howard's anger, her manipulative influence ever present, and her greed had blinded him to the truth that was staring him in the face. I had tried to make him see reason, to open his eyes to the depths of Ellen's betrayal, but his loyalty to her was as stubborn as his temper. And then, at the height of one of those explosive arguments, it happened. The words tumbled from my mouth, fueled by years of suppressed emotions and the sting of Ellen's disloyalty. I lashed out, my anger finally boiling over as I confronted him with the truth he had refused to see. In that moment, as the words left my lips in a torrent of rage, I knew I had gone too far. The sting of Ellen's betrayal was laid bare, and Howard's fury erupted like a volcano, scorching everything in its path. His eyes blazed with a fury I had never seen before, a fury born of wounded pride and the sting of Ellen's betrayal. In that moment, I knew I had pushed him too far, and the consequences of my words would haunt me. The confrontation escalated, our voices rising in a crescendo of anger and accusations. Harsh words were exchanged, each one a dagger aimed at wounding the other. The air crackled with tension, and for a moment I feared that his rage might consume us both. But even as the fury of his words scorched me, I stood my ground, refusing to back down in the face of his anger. I had been a dutiful wife for too long, swallowing my pride and sacrificing my own needs for the sake of our family. In that moment, I was determined to stand tall, to face the consequences of my words, no matter how painful they might be. The confrontation reached its inevitable climax as the truth was laid bare, the sting of Ellen's betrayal finally exposed. And in that moment, as the fury of his anger collided with the truth I had revealed, the consequences of my words became a reality. The air was thick with tension, the silence a harbinger of the storm that was to come, and as the truth was finally exposed, the consequences of my words became a reality that could no longer be denied. As the dust settled, the silence was deafening, a harbinger of the storm that was to come. The truth had been laid bare, and the consequences of my words could no longer be denied. In that moment, the consequences of my words became a reality that could no longer be avoided. The air was thick with tension, a harbinger of the storm that was to come. In the aftermath of that explosive confrontation, the air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Ellen's web of lies had finally been exposed, her true colors laid bare for all to see, and the consequences of her actions were rippling through our family like a shockwave. As the dust settled, I found myself surrounded by a sea of stunned faces, each one reflecting the disbelief and betrayal that hung heavy in the air. Howard, his features twisted with anguish, stood frozen, his gaze flickering between Ellen and me, as if he couldn't quite comprehend the reality that had unfolded before him. Ellen, for her part, seemed to shrink under the weight of the scrutiny, her once imperious demeanor crumbling as the truth of her misdeeds was laid bare. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic ear, but finding none. In that moment, I felt a surge of triumph, a sense of justice finally being served. For too long, Ellen had held sway over our family, her manipulations and lies casting a shadow over our lives. But now, in the harsh light of truth, her carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and she was left exposed, vulnerable, and alone. As the silence stretched on, I could see the realization dawning in Howard's eyes, the weight of Ellen's betrayal finally sinking in. His shoulders slumped, and he turned to me, his expression a mixture of anguish and shame. "Lenore," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." I met his gaze, my own eyes steely with resolve. "You don't have to say anything, Howard," I said, my voice ringing with conviction. "The truth has spoken for itself." He flinched as if I had struck him, and for a moment I felt a twinge of pity for the man who had once been my partner, my confidant. But that pity was quickly overshadowed by a sense of righteous anger, a fury born of years of betrayal and disrespect. "You chose her over me, time and time again," I continued, my words cutting through the silence like a knife. "You turned a blind eye to her lies, her manipulations, all because of some misguided sense of loyalty." Howard opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "No, Howard," I said, my voice firm. "It's my turn to speak now. For too long, I've been the dutiful wife, the one who sacrificed her own needs and desires for the sake of this family. But no more." I turned to face the rest of the gathered crowd, my gaze sweeping over the sea of stunned faces. This house, this property, has been in my family for generations, I said, my voice ringing with conviction. It was my legacy, my birthright, and Ellen tried to take it from me through her lies and deceit. I fixed Ellen with a steely glare, and she shrank back, her eyes downcast. But no more, I said, my voice rising. From this day forward, Ellen is no longer welcome in this house or on this property. She has betrayed the trust of this family for the last time, and she will face the consequences of her actions. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and I could see the nods of agreement, the looks of approval. Ellen's once formidable presence had been reduced to nothing, her power and influence stripped away by the weight of her own lies. I turned back to Howard, my gaze softening ever so slightly. As for you, Howard, I said, my voice tinged with sadness, I loved you once with all my heart, but that love has been poisoned by your betrayal, by your willingness to put your sister's interests above our marriage, above our family. Howard opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing him once more. I'm not finished, I said, my voice steely. If you want to beg for forgiveness, if you want to try and make amends, then you'll have to do it on my terms. This is my house now, my life, and I'll be the one calling the shots from here on out. I could see the resignation in Howard's eyes, the realization that he had lost, that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As for me, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The battle had been won, the war finally over, and I had emerged victorious, my autonomy and self-respect intact. In that moment, I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready to face it head-on. I had reclaimed my life, my legacy, and I would never again allow anyone to take that away from me. As I looked around at the sea of faces, I saw the respect and admiration in their eyes, and I knew that I had not only won a personal victory, but a victory for all those who had been silenced, disrespected, and betrayed by those they loved. It was a bittersweet triumph, to be sure, but one that filled me with a sense of pride and determination. I had fought for what was rightfully mine, and I had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. As I turned and walked away from the crowd, my head held high, I knew that a new chapter was beginning, one filled with endless possibilities and the promise of a life lived on my own terms. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. In the weeks and months that followed my confrontation with Howard and Ellen, a sense of peace began to settle over me. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, a burden that I had carried for far too long finally cast aside. As I went about the process of legally securing my ownership of the house and property, I found myself surrounded by a network of support that I had never truly appreciated before. Ruth was a constant presence, her strength and wisdom a guiding light as I navigated the complexities of the legal system. "You've got this, Lenore," she would say, her eyes shining with pride. "You're finally taking control of your life, and no one can take that away from you." And she was right. For the first time in decades, I felt truly in control of my own destiny, free from the constraints and expectations that had bound me for so long. Even my estranged daughter, Emily, reached out, her initial hesitation giving way to a newfound respect and understanding. We had always had a strained relationship, the weight of my past choices and sacrifices casting a shadow over our bond. But now, as she witnessed the strength and resilience I had found within myself, something shifted between us. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, as we sat together on the porch one warm summer evening, "I'm so proud of you. I had no idea how much you were going through all these years." I smiled, reaching out to take her hand in mine. "It's all right, sweetheart. I made my choices, and I don't regret them. But now, it's time for me to live for myself, to embrace the life that I've always wanted." As the legal proceedings unfolded, Ellen's once formidable presence in our family dwindled to nothing. Her lies and manipulations had been exposed, and the consequences of her actions had left her isolated and shunned. I caught glimpses of her from time to time, her once immaculate appearance disheveled, her eyes haunted by the weight of her own misdeeds. In those moments, I felt a twinge of pity for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of justice. She had brought this upon herself, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her choices. As for Howard, our paths crossed occasionally, and each time I could see the shame and regret etched into his features. He had lost everything: his wife, his sister's trust, and his own sense of self-worth. But still, he persisted in his attempts to make amends, to find some way to rebuild the bridges he had burned. "Lenore," he said to me one day, his voice heavy with emotion, "I know I can never undo the pain I've caused you, but I hope that someday you'll be able to forgive me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man broken by his own mistakes, a man who had finally come to terms with the consequences of his actions. "I forgive you, Howard," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "but that doesn't mean I can forget. The trust between us is gone, and it can never be rebuilt." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and in that moment I knew that he understood. Our marriage was over, our bond irreparably broken, but perhaps in time we could find a way to move forward as friends, as two people who had once loved each other deeply but had been torn apart by the weight of their own choices. As for me, I embraced my newfound freedom with open arms. I reconnected with old friends, rediscovered hobbies and passions that had been pushed aside in the name of being a dutiful wife and mother. I found solace in the simple pleasures of life, tending to my garden, hosting gatherings in the home that had once been a battleground, and reveling in the sense of community that had rallied around me in my time of need. And as the seasons changed and the years passed, I found myself looking back on that tumultuous chapter of my life with a sense of gratitude. For it was in those darkest moments, when everything seemed to be crumbling around me, that I had found the strength and resilience to reclaim my life, to embrace the autonomy and self-respect that had been denied to me for so long. As I stood on the porch of my beloved home, surrounded by the laughter and warmth of friends and family, I knew that I had finally found the peace and happiness that had eluded me for so many years. The road had been long and difficult, but in the end, it had been worth every struggle, every heartache, every moment of doubt, for I had emerged victorious, not just over the betrayal of those closest to me, but over the fears and insecurities that had once held me back. I was the master of my own destiny, the architect of my own happiness. And as I looked out over the rolling hills and fields that had been my family's legacy for generations, I knew that I had finally come home.